Merry Christmas again here on Kingswood's channel. And it's Tuesday. I don't normally do a whole lot on Tuesday, but I just realized it's Christmas Eve. But the more important thing is it's Tuesday for the purpose of this particular update. So last week, on Tuesday, began sharing Glimmer, the first book in my Glimmer Chronicles, on Substack and over on the Arkhaven site. If you're not familiar with Arkhaven, it's a pretty cool comic slash primarily a comic company, but they also open their doors for independent writers to share their work on there with them as well. So, and since I started doing that on those two places on Tuesday, and we're going to continue doing that on Tuesdays, I was like, Self, I should probably also do that here on the channel. We previously shared the audiobook of Glimmer, but that was several years back, and as a result, we're going to do it here again. So we're going to do a chapter a week. This, since we're making up time from last week, we'll do the first two chapters here today, but going forward, it'll be one a week. And the chapters aren't super long, so these shouldn't be super long videos or podcasts for you either. So you'll have fun and enjoy it. And of course, after you enjoy it, you will, of course, be overjoyed to check out the rest of the series, because it's awesome. 7th book just came out. It's definitely worth checking out. So there we go, the first two chapters of Glimmer, and we will get back to one a week, continuing on next Tuesday. Enjoy.
Glimmer, The Glimmer Chronicles, Number 1, by Michael Kingswood. Read by Nathan Dabney. A Dimension Bucket Media production. Chapter 1. Garrett's Gorge. Cold wind whipped past Julian, making his cloak furl out behind him. Biting back a curse, he clutched at the flapping cloth and pulled it back in tight around his body, but not before the momentary exposure had done its damage. What small warmth he had been able to retain was gone, leaving him to shiver in his saddle. The mail shirt he wore didn't help matters, but he had learned the hard way not to go without it. It was supposed to be getting on into spring. Down below, in the lowlands many miles behind him, farmers were tilling their fields in preparation for the first planting. Trees and bushes were beginning to show their first buds, and people could go about their business in less than 3 layers of clothing. But not here, among the peaks of the Saddleback Mountains. Here, winter still clung to the land like a young maiden to her first crush. "Tell me again why we're taking this route?" he muttered with annoyance. Julian's companion looked sidelong at him and rolled his eyes. Raedric was a hand taller than Julian and thin as a stick, with shoulder-length black hair that was tied into a short ponytail at the nape of his neck. Like Julian, Raedric wore a cowled brown cloak of thick wool over his mail, and calf-high leather riding boots. Beyond that, their fashion sense deviated, for while Raedric usually picked shirts and pants of blue and gray, Julian preferred green and browns. They went with his short brown hair and hazel eyes better. Or, at least, that's what the ladies told him. When they first met, Julian thought sure he could break Raedric in half with one hand. He had quickly learned the folly of that. Raedric was quick, and a lot stronger than he looked. And he could wield the saber that hung from his saddle horn with deadly efficiency. "I don't feel like getting caught, do you?" Raedric said. "Not many people come this way anymore since the southern passes became viable. Plus, it's faster." "I'd almost rather take my chances down south," Julian replied. It had been a hard week since they departed Callus. The army did not generally chase deserters, but all the same, if a chance patrol happened upon them, they were done. So they took pains to remain out of sight, which meant they mostly traveled at night. That had been bad enough, but once they made it into the foothills of the mountains, past even the most distant picket lines, the journey had steadily gotten worse. At first Julian had thought riding in the day again would be easier, but as the terrain became more rugged their progress slowed, and the day's riding grew more exhausting. Then, the day before yesterday, they passed through the last of the trees and emerged onto the bare flank of the mountains, leaving them completely exposed to the elements. Fierce gusting winds and lowering temperatures conspired to create a thoroughly miserable day and a restless night. They finally got a bit of relief yesterday afternoon as they put the first few peaks behind them, and then again this morning when they entered Garrett's Gorge. But that was a respite only compared to the bitter cold of the mountain range's flanks, as the last wind gust revealed. At least they had a nice view. Julian had to concede that. About 10 feet to his left, the road abruptly fell away. A sheer cliff, and another one 1/10 of a mile away facing it, formed the walls of the gorge. At the bottom, a couple 100 feet down, the Cascade River flowed, a long series of rapids that only subsided in the foothills far to the west, where it merged with the river Lonele on its way to the Timor Sea. Between the gorge and all the mighty peaks around them, there was always another awe-inspiring sight here. But right then, Julian would trade it all for a nice fire and a warm mug of mulled wine. And a warmer maiden. "Quit complaining," the other man said. "We're almost to the falls. From there, it's just barely half a day to Lyttelton." Julian only grunted in reply. They rode in silence for another hour. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, a low noise began to intrude on Julian's consciousness. At first, it was easy to not notice it, a low rumble that could just as easily be his imagination. But the rumble grew over time until eventually it became impossible to ignore. "What's that? The falls?" Raedric nodded with a wry grin. "Just around the next corner. Brace yourself." Julian snorted. He had seen plenty of waterfalls before. One was much the same as... They rounded the corner, and Julian abandoned the thought as his jaw dropped in amazement. The falls were about 1/4 of a mile ahead, spilling over the side of a jagged mountain peak that rose high above all the others nearby. The falls had to have measured 1,000 feet from the drop-off to the bottom of the gorge, where the river began to flow. Mist billowed off the water as it fell and rose in a great cloud at the fall's base. The rocks on either side of the gorge and on the adjoining flank of the mountain gleamed, frozen mist reflecting the mid-morning sunlight that shined from the west. Julian instantly understood why they were called Silver Falls. If he didn't know better, he would have thought the ice was precious metal from the way it reflected the sunlight. "Gods be good," he said. Or at least, he tried to say it. Even at that distance, the roar from the falls was tremendous. He could barely hear himself speak. "We'll need to protect our ears as we get closer." Raedric leaned over close to Julian's ear as he spoke. Even still, it was hard to understand him. Julian nodded and flipped open one of his saddlebags. After a moment of digging, he found a small lump of wax. Breaking it in two, he held the two pieces in his fists for a moment to soften them up. Then he pressed them into his ears. The roar was immediately muffled, though it was still distinctly noticeable. The two men continued forward. The great mountain peak rose on their side of the gorge, blocking their path like a colossus. But the road shortly veered away from the gorge and the peak itself, instead climbing the mountain's flank on the other side of the peak from the falls. Julian considered, as they turned on the first of what would probably be many switchbacks designed to lessen the road's angle of ascent, that it was probably for the best. He didn't want to think about how difficult the road would be to follow if it was covered in ice from the mist, so the extra few miles to go around the peak were probably worthwhile. Just before noon, after more switchbacks than Julian wanted to count, they reached the road's highest point and paused for a moment. Looking down from their lofty perch, Julian was struck by the beauty of the valley before them. The road descended across the face of the mountain and made its way back to the river just above the falls, then followed the river to a large lake shaped like a kidney bean that dominated the center of the valley. Lake Glimmer, if Julian remembered his maps correctly. Still, except for the wakes from a number of boats making way around the lake, the water reflected the mountains on the other side of the valley with near-pristine clarity. Off to the north of the lake, the valley was wooded all the way up into the mountains. To the south, a few copses punctuated the rolling hills, but for the most part there was only grassland except for a narrow spur of mountains that pushed north almost to the shore of the lake. Two rivers flowed into the lake, one from the north and one from the east. A number of what Julian assumed were farming hamlets clustered in the grasslands surrounding the eastern river. Almost directly opposite the two men on the other side of the valley, Holbart's Pass led away off to the northeast. But the thing that truly drew Julian's eye was the fair-sized town on the north shore of the lake. A sprawling collection of buildings, large and small, surrounding a half-dozen piers that protruded into the lake like the fingers of some great grasping hand. The town of Lyttelton might as well have been the most opulent metropolis in the world. Down there were warm inns, home-cooked meals, and wenches aplenty. He could hardly wait to get there. "Glimmervale," Raedric said in a soft tone. "I've not been here in years." "Looks like a nice enough place." Raedric nodded. "The people are friendly and hospitable, and they have a local recipe for the fish from the lake that is to die for." "Then what are we waiting for?" Julian spurred his horse to motion and began the descent. Behind him, he heard Raedric chuckle before doing the same. Going down was faster than coming up. Before long, they reached the base of the mountain. The road met the river a few hundred yards above the lip of the falls, near a small copse of evergreens. The river was narrow there, maybe 100 feet across, but flowed swiftly toward the drop-off. Julian was struck by how much quieter it was here than down below. Oh, the fall's roar was still plain to hear, but it was nowhere near as deafening as it had been on the other side. I guess the gorge makes it louder, he murmured to himself, earning a curious glance from Raedric. Julian shrugged in response and gestured toward the falls. Raedric nodded. A good thing, too. Can you imagine trying to live next to all that racket? Julian shuddered. The road ran into the copse about 20 feet from the rocks overhanging the river. It was a pleasant change from the bare rock of the last couple days, and Julian found himself grinning as they passed beneath the tree's canopy. The smell of pine was soothing, reminding him of pleasant days from his past. He lost himself in enjoyment for a moment, which made the harsh voice that barked out at them all the more unpleasant. That's far enough. Stop right there. Julian shook himself back to attention and groaned. Half a dozen men stepped out from behind the trees lining the road ahead. They were unshaven, wearing dirty cloaks and leggings that had seen better days. But they also had on what looked like high-quality leather breastplates that were lined with iron studs, leather gauntlets and bracers, and greaves on their shins. 5 of them arranged themselves in a loose arc in the road ahead, while the 6th stood a good few feet back and, knocking an arrow to his bowstring, drew back and sighted in on them. Brigands. Julian and Raedric reined in their horses, and a burly man with a vicious-looking scar on his chin who stood in the center of the ring of 5 spoke. From his voice, he was the same man who spoke before. That made him the leader. Your money or your life, boys, he said. Nice welcome. Chapter 2. A Warm Welcome. Julian and Raedric shared a brief look. This was annoyance they did not need. Julian raised one eyebrow and began inching his hand down toward the pommel of his sword, which hung in its baldric from his saddle horn, a far more comfortable place to keep it while riding than on his hip. Plus, it was easier to draw from there. Raedric saw the movement and gave a slight shake of his head. He always wanted to try to talk first. Of course, considering the numbers in this particular encounter, Julian couldn't really blame him much. He pulled his hand back and looked back at the brigands, waiting for Raedric to take the lead. We don't have much money, Raedric said. A loud snort was the brigand leader's initial reply. And you're gonna have a lot less. Hand it over. Raedric sighed and looked back at Julian again. With a shrug, he said, All right, hand it over, Julian. Julian wore a small pouch tied to his belt. Moving very slowly, he untied it and held it up for the brigands to see. It was filled to overflowing. The leader's expression changed to one of satisfaction. The fellow to his right, wearing an expression of open greed, stepped forward and reached out for it. Here you are, Julian said and moved to toss it to the fellow. He breathed a curse as he apparently lost his grip earlier than he planned, and, instead of landing in the brigand's hand, the pouch flopped onto the ground near Julian's horse's feet. Sorry about that, he managed with a sheepish grin. The brigand bounded forward and bent over to collect the pouch at the same time as his leader shouted, No, you idiot! The brigand stood back up, Julian's pouch in his hand, and looked back at the leader for a heartbeat. That was the opening Julian was looking for. He kicked with his left foot, catching the brigand square in his face as he was returning his gaze back to Julian. With a crunch of breaking bone, the brigand went down, clutching at his nose and jaw. There was a moment's shocked pause while the other brigands looked wild-eyed at their comrade. Julian drove his heels into his horse's sides, urging him into a run. The gelding bounded forward, but only made it a few feet. A second brigand, more quick to recover than the others, grabbed at the horse's bridle and pulled for all he was worth. The world lurched beneath Julian as the horse stumbled and then began to fall. He cursed again as he launched himself out of the saddle and off to the side. Tucking his shoulder as he hit the ground, Julian rolled to his feet and drew his belt knife. Then he spun around. Raedric was still on his feet, laying about with his saber. The brigand Julian had kicked was still down. Another had fallen beneath Raedric's blade, and the brigand he faced wore an expression of panic as he parried, then ducked, then leapt backwards away from Raedric's relentlessly fluid assault. Julian almost felt sorry for the man, having been on the receiving end of Raedric's fencing prowess more than once in the sparring circle. Almost. The archer was nowhere to be seen, though a single arrow was buried deep into a tree trunk not far from where Julian stood. Hopefully Raedric had taken him out, or they were in trouble. But Julian didn't have the time to look around for him, as the brigand who grabbed his gelding was charging at him, followed by the scar-faced leader of the brigands. Julian adjusted his grip on the knife and settled into a loose, ready stance. He forced down a surge of fear as his fighter's mind calculated the odds of survival for a man who brought a knife to a sword fight. They were not good, in his experience. Then the brigand reached him and, drawing his arm back, attacked with a powerful cut from Julian's left to right. It probably would have spilled his guts, but Julian bounded forward inside the brigand's swing. The brigand's sword arm struck Julian in the ribs, and he wrapped his left arm around it, pinning it in place. At the same time, Julian stabbed upward with his knife. The brigand wore an expression of disbelief as the blade entered his neck, severing his carotid artery and trachea. Julian withdrew the knife, and the brigand fell to the ground, spasming out the last of his life. 10 feet away, Scarface came up short, his expression suddenly a mix of wariness and eager anticipation. Behind him, Raedric was nowhere to be seen, though Julian heard the noise of more fighting somewhere off to the left. The leader of the brigands smiled, his grin causing the puckered scar on his chin to expand. For a second, Julian thought sure it was going to swallow the other man's face whole, it grew so large. "This could be fun," Scarface said. "Pick up the sword." His voice was steady and calm despite the grin of excitement on his face. He gestured with his sword point towards his comrade's weapon, now lying at Julian's feet. What was this? Either Scarface was very confident or very stupid. Or maybe both. But Julian wasn't about to question the sudden generosity. Slowly, he lowered into a crouch, and, replacing his knife into its sheath, he took hold of the sword. Scarface came on in a rush, his weapon singing through the air as it descended toward Julian's neck. Desperately parrying upward, Julian flung himself away from the assault. The clang of steel striking steel was still in the air as he completed a full backward roll and rose to his feet. Just in time to meet a second attack from the brigand leader. Another quick retreat left the cut to whistle harmlessly through the air. Julian tried to counterattack, but Scarface's assault was relentless, and he found himself driven backward again. And again. The man was good. Parry, dodge, retreat. Julian gave up more ground, and found himself leaving the copse and treading on the bare rock near the riverbank. Bending his knees to avoid a high cut, he attempted a riposte. Somehow Scarface's high cut became a descending parry that knocked the thrust aside. Then Julian found the wind driven from his lungs as the brigand leader spun around and drove the heel on his boot into Julian's lower ribs. He tumbled to the ground, unable to breathe and awash with pain from his ribs. He felt as much as heard Scarface's blade descending toward him, and forced himself to roll over and raise his own sword. Steel met steel again as the force of the cut's momentum drove the two hilts together in the air above Julian's body. For a moment, the two men looked at each other through the frame of their entwined blades. Finally able to draw a breath, Julian saw that Scarface had barely broken a sweat and was breathing normally. He smirked, a mocking twist of the lips that carried no small amount of disdain, and leaned in, driving the two blades slowly downward despite Julian pushing upwards with all his strength. "Ready to die?" he asked. Julian knew he wasn't going to be able to keep the sword from falling for much longer. Already his arms were shaking from the strain of resisting. Julian abruptly stopped fighting it and rolled with the force of Scarface's push, driving the swords to the ground beside himself. At the same time, he kicked upward and to the side, catching Scarface on his hip. Now it was the brigand leader's turn to tumble to the ground. In the brief respite, Julian bounded to his feet and backed away, gingerly feeling at his ribs with his left hand. The brigand leader flipped to his feet easily and assumed a ready stance, his blade held loosely in both hands with the tip pointing at Julian's eyes. He inclined his head in salute for a moment, the mocking smirk gone from his face. Then he attacked again, and again Julian was driven back. He gave ground with each exchange, and only avoided severe injury on one occasion because of the mail shirt he wore. All the same, he accumulated several small cuts where his parry or dodge wasn't quite fast enough. Scarface remained untouched. The roar of the falls was louder now. Between parries, Julian glanced over his shoulder and was shocked to see that he had retreated almost all the way to the edge of the river, only 20 yards or so from the drop-off. The glance cost him. Julian barely hopped back from another attack, but still took a deep cut in his thigh. He was running out of time and space, and now his balance was off as his thigh protested every movement. Julian attempted another counter, a rising cut toward the brigand leader's armpit. He found his eyes growing wide with surprise as Scarface executed a highly stylized, spiraling parry that ended with the tip of his sword hooking beneath Julian's hilt. A flick of Scarface's wrists pulled the sword from Julian's hand and left him with a deep cut in the meat of his thumb. The sword clattered away somewhere off to the right. Stunned, Julian took a half step back and raised his hand. This couldn't be happening. The brigand leader sneered and snapped off a quick salute with his sword. "Well fought," he said before he began to move forward. Frantic, Julian retreated again. Wait, Raedric. Where was Raedric? Julian looked back towards the cops, but there was still no sign of his friend. Scarface swung at him, and Julian leaned far backwards to avoid a cut that would have taken his head off. All the same, he felt the tip of the sword cut a line across the bridge of his nose. He stumbled back and suddenly found he had nowhere else to go as his heels reached the edge of the rocks overhanging the river. Pinwheeling his arms for a moment to regain his balance, Julian glanced down at the swirling, frigid water as it rushed to the lip of the falls. This was it. He never once imagined it would end this way. He looked up again just as Scarface attacked with a backhanded swing that was again headed for his head. In desperation, Julian moved forward and raised his right arm. Scarface's wrist struck the bones of his forearm. Julian cupped his hand over the brigand leader's wrist and drove his palms upward toward the back of his elbow. The sharp crack of breaking bone preceded Scarface's scream of surprise and pain by a heartbeat. His hand spasmed open, dropping the sword at Julian's feet, and his eyes went wide with shock, then wider still with dread as Julian pivoted about his rear foot and, using the arm as a lever, hurled the brigand leader over the edge of the rocks. His arms and legs flailed at the empty air for a second, then the brigand leader splashed into the river. He bobbed to the surface quickly, but just as quickly began to sink again. Heavy boots and armor make swimming difficult, Julian thought with a certain satisfaction. He watched as Scarface splashed with his one good arm, trying with all his might to avoid being pulled under. "Help me!" Scarface cried, to whom Julian couldn't guess, since he certainly had no intention of lending a hand. The current swept the hapless man toward the drop-off. His swimming attempts became more frantic as he looked with horror toward the approaching edge. "Help! Please!" he screamed. Then he reached the edge and dropped out of sight. His last long scream of despair carried over the fall's roar for a moment, but was quickly overwhelmed. "Well fought," Julian said.
All right, I know what you're thinking. You're thinking, hey, Kingswood, I love that story. How can I buy your books? Great question. Here's the answer. Best way to buy my books is to come over to my site, michaelkingswood.com/store. That will bring you to this place, which is my company's store where you can get books, merchandise, all kinds of great stuff that I've set up. And but you're wondering how it works. Well, here, let's check out Glimmer Chronicles, which is my heroic fantasy series that I've talked a lot about. If you haven't read it yet, you really should. It's a super fun series. Everything you would want. You should start with Glimmer, which is the first book. Come over here to Glimmer. It'll load up. Hey, look at that. You get the book description, links to other books in the series, great stuff, and you can pick the format you want. You got ebook, trade paperback, and audiobook. Not everything I've written is an audiobook yet, but almost everything's a trade paperback and everything's an ebook. But like, hey, I know what you're thinking. Hey, I'm buying from you. How do I get the ebook? There's a service that I work with called Book Funnel. When you buy from my site, they will send you a link. That link will lead you to a page where they will walk you through how to load your ebook onto the device you're choosing, or you can just download it to computer and do whatever you want with it. So that way it's easy peasy. Maximum profit for me. All kinds of fun for you. But I know, a lot of you guys, you like your Kindles, you like your other things, and you want to go straight to the retailer, and that's fine. You can come over here to michaelkingswood.com/books2read, the number 2. And I have this handy dandy universal booklet aggregator page set up. You can scroll through, look at all my stories, all my books, and pick which one you want, and then go from there. Here's how it works. Let's do Glimmer again. So Glimmer, first book in the series, you click on it, you get this thing, you get the book description, you get all other books in the series, and you say, get it now. Okay, get it now. Look what happens. Every retailer where you can find it is here. You can pick the one that you like best and say, okay, cool. Well, let's say I wanted to buy it in, I don't know, let's just say Kobo, because why not? Click on it. And then it'll ask you, is this your favorite store? If so, you set it so every time you come back, you don't have to choose. It'll just go take you to your favorite store. But let's just, you don't have to do that. Well, we're going on to Kobo. Hoo-yah. Hey, look at this. Here it is on the Kobo site. People like it. People have bought it. Good stuff. Links to other things of mine. And, or you can do one of the other stores that you like. Either way, you get the book you like. I get money. It's all good. Either way you choose to do it is awesome. I thank you in advance for your readership, and I hope you enjoy it. All right, so that's the first couple chapters done. We'll be going with chapter 3 next week on Tuesday, and we'll be continuing throughout the rest of this book on Tuesdays going forward. So it's about 32, 33 chapters in the book, so this will take us well into the middle of next year. So sit around and join us every Tuesday for this. And of course, don't forget to buy the book like it just showed you how to do. So, hey, thanks a lot for being here. Merry Christmas. See you on Saturday. Until then, don't do anything I wouldn't do.